So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is English Dawson. I am a senior in the College of Agricultural Sciences, and I will be one of your hosts for this event. So welcome to Native American Foodways, Sustainable Agriculture and Cuisine Across Cultures. I want to ask you to think to yourselves for a moment, where in your lives do you believe you've seen Native Indigenous culture? I would also like to acknowledge that this month is Native American Heritage Month. We welcome everyone attending today into this shared space, and we hope that this event will provide knowledge and information to utilize cuisine and agricultural practices through the lens of Indigenous heritage and culture. Perhaps after this event, you'll be better able to recognize Indigenous culture and work to honor and preserve it yourselves. I'm going to open up a poll now, just so everybody can get a better idea of who they are here learning with this evening. While you respond to those questions, I'm going to share a brief overview of the evening. We will start with a greeting before our speakers present. Following our presenters, we will then have a facilitated Q&A session. You are welcome to submit your questions at any time during the event, and we will address them at the end. This event is also being recorded and can be available upon your request. All right, so let's take a look at the poll here. It looks like a majority of our attendees are undergraduate students in the college and State College area. So welcome to my fellow students. Thank you for joining us. And now that everyone has a better sense of who is in this space with them, I'm honored to introduce my co-host for this event, Dr. Holly Kulago, an associate professor in the College of Education.
Thank you, English. I appreciate your words and your hard work that you have done on organizing this event. Yak and welcome to everybody out there. She'e Holly Anderson Kulago Yenishye, Tsanabisni Nishle, Do Hushklishni Bushishchin, Bilagana Eda Shichedo, Tatne Setni Eda Shanala. I'm originally from the Diné Nation in Arizona, Sawmill, Arizona, near Window Rock, Arizona. And I am happy to facilitate this event with a Penn State senior because it opens up an important discussion of what it means to live upon Indigenous lands, as we all do. I'm a visitor here at University Park. So I consider myself a learner here as well. And I look to those Indigenous peoples of this land to learn from. And it also opens up the discussion of how can we continue to support and stand in solidarity with Indigenous communities. So those are some other questions that you can think about as we work through the presentation this evening. We are honored to have Mr. Tracy Peterson, the Director of Student Transitions and Pre-College Programs in the Center for Engineering Outreach and Inclusion in the College of Engineering, to open up our event tonight. Thank you. Welcome. You're muted, Mr. Peterson.
Yat Aisha, Tracy Peterson, yes, yeah. Nanas Ejet Kabanshle, Twitchini Bashichin, Kiani Dashanella, Twotsoni Dashache, Kuta Dananshle. Good evening, fellow Penn Staters. My name is Tracy Peterson, and as Dr. Kulago stated before, I serve as Director of Student Transitions and Pre-College Programs in the College of Engineering. And I'm going to open up tonight with the acknowledgement of land and sovereignty. The Pennsylvania State University campuses are located on the original homelands of the Erie, the Haudenosaunee, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, and Tuscarora, the Lenni Lenape, the Unalachtigo, the Unami, and the Munsee, also known as the Delaware, the Shawnee, the Absentee, Eastern, and Oklahoma bands, the Susquehannock, and the Wajaji peoples, known as the Osage nations. As a land-grant institution, it is our responsibility to acknowledge the sovereignty and the traditional territories of these tribal nations, the treaties that were used to remove these tribal nations, and the histories of this possession that have allowed for the growth of this institution since 1855. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, understanding the historical and current experiences of Indigenous peoples will help inform the work we do. Collectively, as a university, to engage in building relationships through academic scholarship, collaborative partnerships, community service, enrollment, and retention efforts acknowledging our past, our present, and future Native nations. In the reservation era, our ancestors were forced into abrupt change of lifestyle and struggled to adjust to forced economic and governmental systems. Their traditional ways of hunting, fishing, and harvesting were either outlawed or impossible to continue because of the environmental devastation which had already ensued. In a feeble attempt to uphold treaty violations, the United States government began distributing food, healthcare, and education to Indigenous Native peoples. These programs were not only damaging to Indigenous communities, but they also initiated under the disguise of deception. Commodity food programs introduced heavily processed, fatty, and starchy foreign foods into Indigenous diets. The US government intentionally introduced these unhealthy foods into Indigenous communities with the goal of systematically destroying the traditional knowledge that fueled our minds and bodies. This attack on Indigenous health and well-being was to eradicate the power of the people so that there could be no resistance to continuing theft of Indigenous lands and resources. Tonight's presentation, this event, you will be able to listen to the stories and teachings of two Indigenous chefs, Red Mesa Cuisine owner Lois Ellen Frank and Sacred Seed founder Taylor King. You will gain an insight into a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to the cultural preservation of Indigenous seeds and Indigenous environmentalism. And you will be introduced to a Native American cuisine, which includes wild and cultivated plant ingredients, as well as harvested animal ingredients found on various Indigenous nations throughout the Americas. Additionally, traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, and food sovereignty will be discussed, and how food systems can be reclaimed, revitalized, and reintroduced as essential ingredients to the health and wellness of Indigenous communities. Welcome, and English?
Yes. Thank you so much, Mr. Peterson, for sharing this with us this evening. It is an important reminder of the history of our lands. Our first speaker for this evening is Mr. Taylor King of the Omaha Tribe and Cherokee Nation. He is founder of Sacred Seed, a nonprofit focused on preserving Indigenous seeds and plants. Taylor King is a full-time instructor at the Hyder College of Business Administration and Strategy and Entrepreneurship at Creighton University, and a faculty member of the Creighton Native American Studies program. Mr. King holds a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College, as well as a master's of business administration and a master of public administration from Harvard University, where he served as a fellow in the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. He is the author of a book manuscript entitled Rediscovering America: Sacred Geography, the Ancient Earthen Works, and an Indigenous History of Turtle Island. Known also by the name Bison Maine of the Earthen Bison Clan of Omaha Tribe, Taylor is a lifelong traditionalist. Mr. King.
Thank you, English. Aho, Evidai Wangade, Ijaje, Wiwita, Bagija, Inkesabe, Tomwangadon, Umahabadi. I'd like to say welcome to each and every one of you tonight. Thank you for your kind attention and attendance to these important topics. I'm going to go ahead and go to a screen share here. Okay, so we're going into our 6th year for Sacred Seed. Pardon me, I'm going to turn on my clock. And this has been a wonderful emotional journey for me and all of the wonderful members of Plant Nation that I've gotten to spend some time with. So this journey is a story from the past, understanding where we've come from so we can move forward into the future in a healthy and sustainable way. This story goes back many years now. You're looking at a photo of one of my lifelong mentors, Dr. Deward Walker. He's the chair emeritus of anthropology at CU Boulder. And I met Deward years ago when I first started my teaching career there at CU Boulder. And Deward's an anthropologist, and as Indigenous peoples, historically, we've not always had the best relationship with that part of the academy. Oftentimes was Eurocentric in its origins and its political leanings. But Deward somehow came out on the good side of anthropology, and by that I mean that he was able to do a lot of good things for Indigenous peoples. The Walker Institute has done wonderful work over the years alongside institutions like the Native American Rights Fund there in Boulder, Colorado. He's worked with numerous tribes and published on topics of sacred geography, which has really influenced my world of research and writing and sharing. Deward's always been ahead of the curve, and this was probably 13 or 14 years ago. He would often call me up, and he still does. And he always shares a bunch of interesting ideas and notions. On this particular phone call, he called me up, and this is how he talks. "Young man, what are you doing to protect your corn?" And I said, "Do what, Deward? Corn? What?" He says, "Your tribal corn. What are you doing to protect it?" And what he was alluding to was the habits and actions of certain of what I would call the big ag or big seed companies like Monsanto and Syngenta, about how they had gone to the country of India and were displacing small tenant farmers out of their indigenous heirloom seeds onto their genetically modified organism seeds. And there's actually a really good documentary film on it called Seed the Movie. I'd highly encourage it. During the Q&A, I will try to get a link and post it. It's a fantastic video. And it also documents what's happening with Indigenous peoples and our journeys backwards in time to find our old seeds and to promote Plant Nation. So at that point, I didn't realize what was happening, but Deward's one explained to me some of the notions around intellectual property rights and the big ag seed industry. So many states, including Nebraska, where I'm coming from, up until about 5 years ago, it was illegal for individual seed keepers to share seeds together. That was the stranglehold. And a very deep, complicated topic about intellectual property rights, but in essence, if any of the big GMO corn pollinates any of the seeds that we grow, they would own our seeds. And there's a very long and complicated past into that, but it goes back to the 1920s and the formation of a lot of these early seed companies. And so that planted a seed, as it were. And a few years after that, when I was serving on the National Council for the Cherokee Nation as an at-large legislator, this gentleman, Pat Gwynn, our Cherokee Nation biologist and the head of our ethno-ag department, he came in to one of our Natural Resource Committee meetings and put up this picture of the seed vault in Svalbard, Norway, and was talking about it. And it was at that point that I raised my hand and said, "Hey, Pat, it's really important what you're talking about here," because he was wondering if we should be putting some of our seeds back in the vault. And I was reminded of Deward's conversation with me about this. And I said, "Hey, Pat, should we be well, first of all, do those big ag seed companies like Monsanto and Syngenta, do they have some of our seeds? And should we be worried about that? And he says, no, they probably have them, but no, we shouldn't be worried about it. And I was very surprised at that answer. And so I said, please explain more. And I'll never forget his words at the time, which were, no, doesn't matter who else has it. What matters is that we as Indigenous people, we as Cherokees, need to reestablish our relationship with the plant nation, and that we need to be growing corn, beans, squash, the Three Sisters. And I was very impressed by that. This previous picture is Cherokee Nation's one of their versions of a seed vault. Looks like a big fridge to me, but it's at the right temperature and it helps keep seeds preserved for longer periods. Recently, the Cherokee Nation Seed Bank was asked to put seeds into the International Seed Vault there at Svalbard. So eventually, about 5 years later, they established their seed bank, and I was no longer on the Cherokee National Council, but was still very interested in the work, and had tracked down Pat and said, hey, where are you guys at with these? And he says, tell you what, come on down next time you come home and I'll get some seeds to you. So he gave me a handful of seeds. They were just getting started at the time, and you're looking here at a Cherokee white flower variety. And the squash, they didn't have any at that time, or at least that was the allocation that I was given. But there were some Trail of Tear beans in there, which literally sustained us Cherokees on the Trail of Tears from our displacement and dislocation out of our homelands in the Southeast. But I took those, there were 6 or 7 plants in each of these plots, and just a little section of my backyard. But I had never grown much of anything, but talked to some people and figured out what to do and protected them from the bunnies, etc. And this was the yield that came out of there. So in general, these varieties, this white flower corn, if you can see my cursor there, that's typically what they looked like when they came out of the package. And by this point, I had a seminar at my college, at my university. And so I had students helping. And I remember we brought them in and husked them down and were amazed to see all the variations in color. And so this was the official shot that I sent back to Dr. Gwen. You can see our little seed bank emblem. Those were some of the seeds that we didn't use. So I immediately sent it off to him, and very rapidly I got a return email back from Dr. Gwen. My question was, did we get cross-pollinated here? Should I be concerned? And he gave back 10 long answers, a full page worth of stuff, everything from, yes, it could be DNA degradation, but it doesn't appear so. And on the other end of the extreme was, well, what we're looking at here is phenotypic variation. So the plant, where he was so interested in the Cherokee corn being grown up in Nebraska, in his words, that's corn country. So this corn should thrive there. And in essence, what's happening is you see the plant is experimenting with different types of colors to filter out different types of ultraviolet light to optimize itself. So even some of these plants were not green like you would see in most cornfields in Iowa and Nebraska. They became red. And this was really a pink variety, and this was an orangish more than anything, and a true deep dark red. So we had a full spectrum. And that was very exciting for all of us. These were some of the Trail of Tear beans, and the reason why I love this shot is because you can really see the depth of color. One of the things that many of the Iroquoian speaking tribes and many of the tribes all along the East Coast revere is the shell that we refer to as wampum, which comes from a clam there on the East Coast. And those shells are turned into beads. And ironically, many of the colors of the wampum you see here in the Trail of Tear beans. So I thought that was beautiful and fascinating. Within the class, there must have been 10 or 12 students that joined my seminar. And we began to explore different things along the way. From one of the book reviews, one of my students, she found a little bit further into the story of this. This book was so powerful and so amazing to our journeys here in the heartland indigenous seed keepers trying to find their way back. So this was written by George Will, who was the son of Oscar Will, who had been involved in the trading posts out in western Nebraska back in the 1800s. And so all those different tribes, including my mother's tribe, the Omahas and the Lakota and the Pawnee and the Iowa and the Oto, they all shared and traded at the trading post with their plant crops. And so interestingly enough, somewhere around the time frame of in the 1890s, he started his own seed company. And I didn't even realize it until my student Jessica had read in the foreword that George's father, Oscar, had been the one to commercialize indigenous corn into this seed company. And so there was many years where they did a lot of respectful detailing of what the tribes were doing. So this is one of the covers. This is the most important one for the topic that we're discussing tonight, is the moment of appropriation. And so you can see from this artistic diptych here that on the left side, it says the Indian of Dakota gives the squaw corn to the pioneer seed growers in 1882. So here he has ancestor. And then it shows the same European pioneer, now a yeoman agrarian farmer in a field of pioneer bred Dakota seed corn, the Dakota, the Gehu, and those are the descendants. And so we fast forward to today, understanding the role of cultural and commercial appropriation. Corn has been evolving for over 10,000 years, originating out of Mesoamerica. And to see that it was only 1911 thereabouts, and I'm sure this was just one of several individuals who commercialized Indian corn into the sweet yellow and white varieties that we have today. But it was as if we turned over our only sustenance. Most of our indigenous cultures, we refer to her as Mother Corn. It's one of our part of the sacred feminine. Many of the tribes, my father's tribe, the Cherokee's first woman is Selu. Out of her body was born the corn that the Thunder Twins shared with all the Cherokee peoples. So there's a lot happening here. One is a mistelling of what happened. What happened was he was at the trading post, kept a bunch of the corn, and then turned it into his own seed company. So we have the moment of appropriation to this day. Many people look at our Indian corn and heard it zillions of times that you can't eat it. And you only can find it to buy it around Thanksgiving time. And it's typically in a cornucopia with a bunch of other wild squashes. And so we have this legacy here that corn was appropriated away from Native peoples. Along the way, one of the books that we read is Braiding Sweetgrass, and I've got a link for that. I'll put in, if there is some type of chat function in the Q&A, I can share that. But I was fortunate enough to co-present alongside Dr. Kimmerer here. We were at a conference in Ohio, and we're standing in front of a tree of life, a bur oak, a type of white oak. And the reason I really wanted to take a picture with her is because we enjoyed her books so much in the class. And one of the things that came out of it, understanding notions of sacredness. When we started Sacred Seed, we weren't sure whether we were going to be a for-profit seed bank that sold seed to people or what we were going to actually do with it. There was a chapter in her work that Robin had a dream about, where she went to a market where everything was sacred, where money wasn't allowed. And the students really enjoyed that. And so we decided from that point on that Sacred Seed was just going to enjoy the growing and the sharing of all the sacred plants that were given to us by our ancestors. This is just a quick purview into what I did at my house. I worked with the local Omaha permaculture group, and this is Gus Van Roen. He's the president and the the head of the organization, and they were employing permaculture techniques into my backyard there in Midtown Omaha. So this is kind of a beforehand, and this is a view afterwards. So my home, that's the second story, and so what you're looking down upon is you see these power and utility lines here. They're at 12 feet. And so that first year that we tilled, there was an explosion of nitrogen, and you see the corn and the sunflowers just exploding. It was quite the jungle, and got a lot of attention from the media and from my neighbors as well. One of the notions that came out of the class was we were discussing the work, and it really started as kind of a side note, but the work meant that we would till the land by hand, and that we do as much as possible to get our hands into the earth and follow the cycles of the moons and the seasons, and really exploring a lot of traditional culture from my perspective, from my two tribes, into the work of sacred seed. Along the way, we've been able to be blessed to have found some old strains. People say, where did you get your seed from? From lots and lots of places. Sometimes working with other groups. There is a group called Braiding the Sacred, which has a lot of other indigenous seed keepers. And one of the things I found from George Will's book about his father's work was that there was a strain of rainbow flint, and I actually found half an ear of that. And you're looking at me amongst those huge corn plants there. So I'm 6 foot, so that's going on 13, the tips of the corn tassels there. Many of the tribes, a lot of this is sacred. My clan, the Black Shoulder, the Earth and Bison clan, we all have different responsibilities, and part of the responsibility for my clan is that we're keepers of the sacred red corn. And so that was so important to me to be able to bring that back. And so this was the first ear of those ruby red flints, and almost translucent in the sun. Absolutely gorgeous. So we've been able to reclaim some of our plant sovereignty with our corn for the Omaha tribe because of that. So if I can get this to work. So one of the things that when I went back to my clan and my clan elders to ask permission to begin upon this journey, for seemingly so much that we had lost, it was amazing how much was still there. And I remember one of elders in my clan, they said, you're supposed to sing to the corn, nephew. And I said, okay. So we at one point used to have all of our corn songs as a tribe. We're still trying to bring those back. To my Dene friends on this call, that is a Native American church Dene morning song there, a straight song. The corn likes it, so that's what I share with them. On to the food portions of it. The first year that I had my class, once we had harvested everything, the students said, well, there's nothing left to do. And I said, oh no, there's always stuff to do. And so that's the first year that we had an Indigenous Thanksgiving celebration. And so we took a lot of our crops, and we've been partnering every year with a different chef. And this is the menu from one of those years. And here's a gorgeous meal of all sorts of yummy stuff in there. That was elk brisket we had that year. Finish up here by going into some of the partnerships as we're going. First 2 or 3 years was working with a lot of seed ambassadors, and then I got approached by another group. This was a vacant plot in downtown Omaha, so literally amongst all the corporate buildings of downtown Omaha. Started about 3 years ago, and we got a little more into it in the last 3 here. but this is the Sacred Seed Pop-Up. You can follow us on Facebook or Instagram. Along the way, wonderful author Charles C. Mann, 1491, 1493, and The Wizard and the Prophet. He came down and interviewed me for a couple of days. I'm going to be in his next book on the West, and so we obviously were having a good time down in the Pop-Up there. Another wonderful author and leader in our seed sovereignty movement is Liz Hoover. She's got a wonderful book called Food Sovereignty in the United States. Other people who have friends that I've got to meet up there at the Pop-Up. Final partnership is here with the Land Institute through a research farm down in Salina, Kansas. They're really deep into perennial crops and deep root structures. And so I gifted to them some of the four sisters. The Omahas have a fourth, the sunflower, which blocks the wind. And so that's developed a very fun relationship. First year we planted, they did not do well on the corn, but that is a Moon and Stars variety and a monstrous melon. And I thought I would finish with that. English, I think I am right under 20 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Keene, for sharing with us the journey of Sacred Seed and the importance of cultural preservation of Indigenous seed and Indigenous environmentalism. Our next speaker for this evening is Dr. Lois Ellen Frank, who is Sephardic and of the Kiowa tribe. Dr. Frank is a Santa Fe, New Mexico-based Native American chef, a native foods historian, culinary anthropologist, educator, photographer, organic gardener, and a James Beard Award-winning cookbook author for her book, Foods of the Southwest Indian Nations. She is the chef and owner of Red Mesa Cuisine, a Native American catering company specializing in the revitalization of ancestral Native American cuisine with a modern twist. Dr. Frank has spent over 30 years documenting and working with foods and lifeways of Native American communities in the Southwest. In 2020, she was the recipient of the Local Hero Ola Award, which recognizes an exceptional individual for their work they do to create healthy, innovative, vibrant, and resilient local sustainable food systems in New Mexico. Dr. Frank?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Lois Ellen Frank, Acho. I'm from Kiowa Nation on my mom's side and Sephardic on my dad's side. So I'm going to be talking tonight about our Native American foodways, and I consider this a harvest of gratitude, and this is really important. I'm going to introduce some slightly different concepts than Mr. Keene, and I think it goes fairly nicely. It'll be a nice complement to that. So this is perfect. When we think about native foods, our farming, our foods, we think about feeding the body, nurturing the soul, and we have to reconnect to our culture. And this is a key, not only to our health and wellness as Native people, but to reintroducing and reinvigorating our ancestral diet. And in order to do that, we have to know what happened in the past. So what did our ancestors do? Well, they used food for physical health and wellness, but also to connect to our culture and mental and spiritual. You know, there's the medicine wheel, there's all the different components of what make us up. And this is all incorporated into health and wellness. So food is much more than just something to eat. It's our medicine, it's our sovereign right, and it is the key to our health and wellness. So what we do is we look at our seed and we see that growth process. We see that life takes hold, and this is part of the medicine. But in order to perpetuate knowledge, we have to learn how to plant, how to grow, how to harvest, and how to cook. And yes, there are different stages of this. And the only way that we can pass on information is if we know this. So each generation that follows us we have to know what to tell them. We're going into winter. So winter is traditionally storytelling. This is where we pass on our oral traditions. And, you know, you have to look at the whole. So I'm trying to do a very holistic view of this, is that our ceremonies have always honored many of our sacred foods, and we give gratitude to everything we harvest. This is a form of our own food sovereignty, and this is a healthy connection to our culture. So this is Okeawinge. These are the Okeawinge dancers. And so the health of the land is inextricably linked to the health of the people. You can't have one without the other. It's interconnected. And access to our traditional foods is really, really important. What does that mean? Well, that means that the bison, which is a pre-contact food, is being reintroduced, it's being reclaimed, and it's being revitalized. I'm Plains tribe, so the bison was very, very important to us. But using bison, our herds were almost completely wiped out in the 1800s from Western European settlers. And what's fascinating is they weren't wiped out for food. The carcasses were left to rot. They were wiped out because the robes gave warmth, and people wanted to be warm in this new land. So we have to take a look at the past. We have to understand what happened in order to move forward and reclaim and revitalize what we have. So there are 4 distinct periods in Native American cuisine. The timeline is the pre-contact period, the first contact period, the government issue period, and the new Native American cuisine. And the new Native is where we are now. So what this means is that these ancestral cultivated wild plants and animals go back 10,000 years up until first contact, so 1492. And these were diverse. Every tribe had different ways of harvesting and processing and growing their food. And then from 1492 to about the 1800s, we see foods that were introduced by Europeans. And these foods, I think sheep is a really good example, were woven into the fabric of who the Dene are now. So it's inseparable with the group's identity. The government issue period, this is the most problematic, this is the most unpleasant to talk about. Forced relocation onto reservations. My tribe removed completely from its ancestral homelands into Oklahoma, a foreign land. We were used to much different land bases. And so this started middle to late 1800s, and we call this the government issue. And this is when the commodity foods were introduced. And the new Native, which is components from the first 3, and this is where we are now. So fusion or fused together innovatively by Native chefs. So the first contact period are what we call the magic 8. Corn, beans, squash, chili, tomato, potato, vanilla, and cacao. And what's fascinating is this isn't in any of the curriculums. I'm an adjunct professor at IAIA. I do an Indigenous food class, and I make sure that my students understand this. But these are all foods that Native people gave to the world. So that means that the Italians didn't have the tomato. The Irish didn't have the potato. Russians didn't have the potato. No vodka from the potato. No chilies in any Asian cuisine. No chilies in East Indian curries. It's phenomenal. The Brits, Britain didn't have their chips. They had their fish. So many of these foods that were given to the world were not acknowledged by Native people. Corn is the most important and the most profound. Oral tradition brings it back about 9,500 years ago. Western science a little later, about 8,000, but it's still within that. And corn has many, 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 many layers of meaning. Corn is a gift. She's storyteller, she's maiden, she's mother, she's sister, she's healer, she's medicine, she's sustenance. She is our cuisine, she is art, she is the essence of life. So corn, many, many, many layers of meaning outside of just that concept of food. And think about corn. Corn is a perennial. It is dependent on man to cultivate. It is indigenous. and it is considered to be a gift to the tribes from as far north as it'll grow to as far south as it'll grow. So corn, here is Calandra, and she will use corn as part of her kinalda, a coming of age ceremony. This is Chef Walter Whitewater's daughter, who I work with at Red Mesa. And so corn, very important. But corn is also used, the pollen, as an offering to greet the sun or in a ceremony. And so this is Tiffany, and she's getting corn pollen to make an offering before planting. Her family will grow corn, squash, melons, sunflowers, and tomatoes, and they're going to be using a dry farming method. Beans, for me, sustenance in a pot. I eat beans almost every day in the form of hummus or something along those lines. They're high in protein. They've got fiber, tons of vitamins. They're a slow release food. They are perfect for reducing blood sugar, blood pressure, improving cholesterol. I mean, these are just amazing. And so beans, and this is my favorite bean. This is called Bobby. It's from the Akmil Otam or the Tohono Otam people. It's a drought tolerant bean. It's a little bush bean, and it's 23 to 30% higher in protein than any other bean. So beans are really truly a true energy food. Squash is considered a superfood. It too is high in fiber, antioxidants, vitamin A, vitamin C, B6, lots of minerals, just amazing when you think about it. And there are many different kinds of squash. So we have the summer squash where you eat the outside, and the winter squash where you do not eat the outside. And this is amazing because Native people ate the summer squash in the summer, and now we're moving into those hard shelled squashes, and we will eat the squash throughout the winter. So squash, very important. And Mr. Keene talked about the three sisters. Again, the three sisters really important, not only with the nutrients they provide, but the way they grow. Corn needs nitrogen. Beans give nitrogen. Beans need a pole. Corn is the perfect pole. Squash has big leaves shading the ground, keeping moisture in, and creating shade so that weeds don't grow. So just really important. Chilies, again, chock full of medicine. They release endorphins in the body. They can be used. One green chili has the equivalent of 6 oranges. We never needed citrus. We never had citrus. We had chilies. So topically, they can be used. They're just amazing. Here in New Mexico, sort of the land of the chilies, we have red and green. Our state question is actually red or green. What are they asking you? What kind of chili do you want? So chilies add flavor, they add vitamins, and they add lots of nutrients. And if you look at them, they're the most amazingly beautiful fruit, ranging in heat from very mild to very hot. So chilies, very important. And chilies do only what exercise and chocolate do. It's pretty fascinating as they release endorphins into the body when you eat them. Okay, so the body's actually responding to that heat. These are natural painkillers, and you're left with like a high, a feeling of a good response. And so chocolate and chilies do the same thing. The only other way to get this endorphin response in the body is to exercise. So obviously exercise much more labor intensive than eating chilies or chocolate. Tomatoes, also lots of vitamins, antioxidants, and a great source of potassium, folate, and vitamin K. Potatoes, going back 7,000 to 10,000 years, full of good carbohydrates, lots of protein, fiber. There were over 600 kinds of potatoes prior to 1492 upon first contact. And if you go to the supermarket now, you're lucky if you see what you can count on one hand. So we had lots of different, these are from the Inca, and they date back, and they do very well at high altitudes. Vanilla, highly valued for its flavor. They come from an orchid. Think, how did the ancestors know how to harvest this? How to harvest this pod, this orchid seed pod, for its delicious flavor. And cacao, which we all know of as chocolate, they can be dried. Again, how did the ancestors know? This is the TEK. This is the idea of food sovereignty and TEK to process these, to take a pod and roast it and then grind it. And we do know that cacao, of course, based on archaeological remains, was found in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, radiocarbon dated at over 1,500 years old. So even though it originated to the south, we see this here in New Mexico. Wild foods, also very important. The pecan, when there was no wild game here in New Mexico, this was used to supplement half a cup of pecans, 691 calories, lots of those good fats. It's other seed that was used, nut, the pinon, half a cup, 673 calories. Again, very, very, very important, especially when animals migrated differently. These plant-based proteins gave people lots. Chokecherry, very important to me. I've actually planted what I call an edible landscape. We harvested from my front yard this year during COVID, 33 pounds of chokecherry, which we processed into a juice and then a sauce and then a reduction. And we freeze it and then we'll use it throughout the year. Wild teas, all kinds of medicinal plants that help with all kinds of kidney stimulants and blood purifiers. So again, using those medicinal plants for health and wellness and this idea of sovereignty and reclaiming. My favorite, this grows all over the United States. It's a weed. It's called purslane. Here in New Mexico, it's also called verdolaga. Higher in omega-3 fatty acids than a piece of salmon. So this is amazing. It's got lots of minerals and it can be eaten in a variety of ways. First contact, so after 1492, Europeans introduced sheep, pork, beef, chicken, eggs, dairy. We had no dairy. Whether or not Native people tried to milk a lactating wild bison is up for grabs. But they certainly learned very quickly that it was not going to happen. So we had no dairy, all the melons, the stone fruit, cabbage, wheat, wine grapes, and others introduced. And so we do see a lot of these foods woven into native foods now. We saw some beautiful melons in some of the other slides. And so very important, this is a native food, but it's first contact, as is sheep and some of the other foods that were introduced. The government issue, this comes from forced relocation. Native communities lost agriculture and hunting bases. And so the government stepped in, issuing foods. Tracy Peterson talked about, very high in fat, flour, lard, coffee, sugar, canned meats like Spam, that was introduced. This is where the Indian taco and fry bread is born, this period. And of course, fine to do once or twice a year, but you cannot do it every day and expect to remain healthy because of the fried and lard. So Native American food sovereignty, what is that? It's a form of food justice. It's a form of food security, environmental justice. It's dependent on TEK. We've got to have that indigenous knowledge. And this is where communities are able to produce, grow, harvest their own food, and also buy and trade with other native growers, farmers, seed collectors, etc. So this reconnects us to our land, our community, and our culture. TEK, very, very important. I drill this into my students' heads. So students, those of you listening, look this up, learn about this. This means that we are able to perpetuate the wisdom of the ancestors that is handed down through generations. This is part of our wellness. And it's passed down through stories, songs, beliefs, from one generation to the other. So it's passed down orally, and that oral tradition is as valid as any Western science. This is our science. This is our native science. This is a picture of my garden growing out. We do mulch, corn, bean, squash. We also do flowers just to make sure bees want to come and pollinate. The corn we pollinate by hand with the silk from the pollen. And then we harvest after our first frost. This is myself and Walter Whitewater harvesting blue and white corn. And then we grind this into a flour, and that's what we cook with. But we're not the only ones. Chisuki Pueblo has done very, very well. They took barren land. They now have hoop houses, fruit trees, berries, lots of crops. This is Amikdio Bayonne, who's actually Quechua, and Gailey Morgan. And they don't fence it in. The elk come in and they do eat some of the apples. They do eat the berries. And then the tribe will harvest or take down through an offering one or two of those elk. So it's all within that cycle. These are my students helping to plant in between the rows of the fruit trees. We make a trip every year as part of our Indigenous food class. And other communities, this is Pinon, Dene community in Arizona, traditionally harvesting their corn, which was dry farmed, and then roasting it overnight in an outdoor oven. Wilmer Kavina, growing corn in Hopi. So again, this is all about TEK. This is all about food sovereignty. This is my student, Kelly Tungovia, from this year, May of 2020. And her final presentation was about corn to the Hopi people, the importance of corn and corn grinding. Once the corn is ground, it's used in some of the traditional foods like piki. This is an ancient cornbread using water, culinary ash, and cornmeal. And here it is used in a contemporary fashion with some hummus. And it is one of the most delicious breads that I've ever had. It will not modernize to the modern kitchen. It refuses to do so. So it's holding on to its ancestral roots. So all of these foods that are grown and sourced and processed are an important part of our health and wellness. So this is now bringing us into the new native. So the new native, again, food is our medicine. That's the underlying theme here. And we want to use these foods for reclaiming our health and wellness. Here are some examples of foods that we prepare, different versions, contemporary versions of very ancestral or ancient foods. Here's a very old recipe made modern. Again, some of the foods, if we don't know how to process or cook those, they have to be taught through education. And then we can work with communities on how to reintroduce, reinvigorate those foods for health and wellness. So education is crucial, you guys. We need to educate, we need workshops, we need lots of ways to bring this information to the forefront. We work with the public school system here in Santa Fe. We work from 5 to 14-year-olds. So we do everything traditional. We show the students as young as 6 how to make something. It's very empowering. Make a stew. We do a no fry bread. So here you see some 10-year-olds making that fry bread and then actually grilling it. So we're not frying it into a tortilla bread over an open flame. And they're learning how to make these into health and wellness. Culinary students taking the old, bringing it into the new. Again, very old recipe. How do we use corn mush, make it into a parfait? We can add fruit, we can add nuts. And so all of these are a part of this movement, and this movement, very, very important, the Native American food movement. We need land, we need knowledge, we need the ability and the right, we need our food sovereignty, and we need education to be able to pass this on. I don't know how many of you know this, but the spiral design means lots of petroglyphs. So the beginning knowledge, traditional knowledge, starting at the beginning of time, spiraling outward. 4 dots for us represent 4 generations: child, adolescent, middle-aged, and elder. Takes 1 generation, guys, for a language, a story, a song to disappear. So it's vital that we pass this information on to the youth. You guys at college level, this is perfect for you to pass this forward, learn, ask questions, get involved, start to garden. And then we have a new paradigm. We have great new outcomes. We activate TEK, we recover social values, we transition from only Western to Western and in tandem Native, and we have access. We strengthen partnerships. And so all of this vitally important to perpetuating our Indigenous knowledge. And I'm going to end one of my students and did an internship with me. We still work together, Tidra Bigay. When I'm around native foods, it always reminds me of grandma's house, because that's when I got to eat when I would go home. Now I'm trying to learn the importance of making the same food for myself and keeping these native foods alive in my own life. And so really important, you're welcome. This is my contact information. Take a screenshot of this. And this is my life's work. Definitely something I am passionate about. And so I'm gonna turn it back over to English. And thank you so much for watching this presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Frank, and thank you, Mr. Keene, for your insightful presentations. Learned a lot, and I'm really sorry that we have to meet via Zoom, because otherwise I'm sure we'd all be eating together and sharing stories. And if anyone knows me, you know I like to eat, so I'm always like, let's bring food, let's get food. So another thing COVID has taken from us is all the food we have to not share. Okay, so we do have a few questions from the audience right now, so we'll go ahead and move into those. These are coming from the Q&A section. So in general, somebody asked if this presentation was being recorded, and it is. So you can email English. She's sharing her contact information at the end of the presentation. Or you can visit the Penn State Student Farm later this week. This video will be uploaded to the site there. So that's one question. And the audience is wondering if the PowerPoint presentations would be available as well. So that's something you all can answer when you address one of the other questions, I guess. So one of the questions that came up is during Mr. Keene's presentation is the question, does the seed vault keep seeds from being used in GMO labs to keep the plants real and natural? Mr. Keene, you want to answer that?
I did do a typewritten answer, but it's just like Dr. Gwynn had said, it's more important for us to, as Indigenous peoples, develop those relationship with those seeds. And if we have our own seed banks, then we can do it. But those seed banks, those seed vaults, the one in Svalbard is meant to be there for any catastrophic things that happened. And I know, I can't remember which country it was, but through a horrible civil war, they literally, many of their food crops were devastated in the warfare. And so the Svalbard Seed Bank was able to bring back those varieties and make sure that the line continues. There is enough older seed banks out there, especially with the U.S. Department of Ag, that my guess is all those big seed ag companies probably have whatever they want to from indigenous seeds, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that we continue to grow them. Hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, were there other significant purposes for the diverse corn cultivated by the first peoples apart from food? If so, what were they? And I did see, Mr. Keene, that you did respond in the Q&A section, and you pointed to what Dr. Frank just said about using corn pollen in ceremonies and other uses of the corn in ceremonies. So either Dr. Frank or Mr. Keene, do you know of other ways that Indigenous people use corn?
Dr. Frank, I'll defer to you. So, you know, all of us use corn in different ways. I'm living in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The Pueblo people use cornmeal as an offering. Corn is used in dancing. You hold the corn. So corn is used in a lot of different ways. One of the things, and you know, Taylor Keene talked about, many of the tribes are very private about how some of these ceremonies and these offerings are used, and that is because of appropriation. So While we might know that an offering is used in a certain tribe, how they do it or what words are spoken is really something on the spiritual level, and that remains private in many Native communities. Taylor, do you want to add anything else to that?
No, I think you've covered it very well. So many of these things are so intimate to tribal peoples, and all I can comment is for sure is that she is central to the sacred feminine for almost all the tribes, and in our stories, she's always first woman. She is keeper of seeds, giver of wisdom and life. So it's all a part of a beautiful cosmology that we tribes also choose to keep some of those things secret, but at the same time, I think that needs to be understood by everyone in the world so they can help better respect these seeds. So some point, there's many prophecies of tribal peoples about how we're gonna learn to share these things in a respectful way that respects Plant Nation.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. And I think, Mr. Keene, what you're saying about being able to share these information in a respectful way means we have to be respectful, and the people receiving the information have to be respectful. So it's not just a one-sided, well, share your information with us. It's no, you gotta know what to do with this kind of knowledge if we're gonna share it, right? You have to know how to be respectful of it. And we also use other parts of the corn, like tamales. We use the corn husks, and we use stalks and things like that. So it is more than a fall time Halloween decoration. So we'll look at the next question. This one came up while Dr. Frank was talking. It says, were there any major monocultural agriculture methods similar to the ones we are used to today practiced by any of the Native American nations before European influence, or was this form of agriculture largely foreign to the Native people?
So that's a great question. Monocropping is definitely Western. Native people always planted in a permaculture type of way, in mounds together. Plants like each other. They need each other. They feed off each other. They grow well together. And so Native people have always been able to identify what flowers. I know here, the bee plant, you notice in the picture of my garden, I had some cosmos. We're always planting lots of flowers to bring in those bees. We have bee plants here. And so plants do want to grow together, and they grow well together. And so the idea of rows and stripping everything, even the purslane, the weed that I talked about, it loves to come up in between the rows. It loves disturbed soil. And so we've always allowed weeds or wild spinach or wild plants to come and grow with these other plants. And that's really important to identify. And I would love Taylor Keene to also comment on this, because he's such a seed person, but this is very important.
I think you did a great job, Dr. Frank, of explaining everything.
Okay, thank you. The next question that came up was, how do you reclaim TEK that has since been lost?
I'll give an initial response, Dr. Frank. This is a very serious issue, and in summation, a lot of our teachings refers to notions such as blood memory, is how I've been told. What I do know is that Creator and Spirit are there waiting for us, as well as spirits of our ancestors. And once I know, by putting my hands back in the soil and trying and redeveloping a relationship with these different plants, that they begin to speak to me. And so in between us having a good open heart and align with the land and the plants in a respectful manner, then they will teach us. Dr. Frank?
I love the answer. And one of my students did his final paper on blood memory. So this is definitely something that you might want to also call it ancestral DNA. It's in our makeup. And so in some instances, in a very modern sense where I work with communities and some of the information, maybe the cord has been broken or it hasn't been able to be passed on, we can revitalize and reinvigorate that TEK the same way our ancestors would have. So how has TEK evolved? Through trial and error and what works well. And so some of that knowledge, if we're missing a piece, we can start to re-put it back together. Some of it's through blood memory, through the touching, through prayer, through song. But yes, many of these things can be reintroduced and revitalized in a modern context based on ancestral knowledge.
Okay, thank you for your responses. I'm also thinking about how these things were originally learned, through the land. We have to get back to the land and learn from it and know how to learn from it, right? We can't just go there and expecting to learn something. We really have to put work into it. And also thinking about the things that are in place now that colonization has created that have changed the land. So it's not necessarily going to be the same, right? But we still have to keep moving forward and also looking to the community. We can't, as individuals, try to figure this out, that blood memory and DNA, that's all comes from the land, but it also comes as a collective. We are not individuals. And so we also have to think about that collective knowledge that we all can come together and share. So thank you. Another question, with the removal of Native peoples from their historic land, are there issues with the seeds growing in the new locations?
Absolutely. Major changes. I know that's one of the reasons why the Cherokee Nation Seed Bank was so interested in me taking Cherokee corn that had seen the Carolinas, et cetera, and had seen Oklahoma, that had never really been to truly fertile corn country. And so it was, it's a challenge. The plants adapt, as I talked about in my presentation, with different colors of corn silks and the plants themselves as they began to experiment into their new homes. But overall, I think the answer is dual-fold. One is, I know it's one of my dreams living in Nebraska and in Iowa, is to do as much as I can to facilitate the return of those peoples who are inherently from these parts of the land. For example, the Pawnee in Nebraska. I consider it a lifelong mission to do what I can to better facilitate their return, their connection to their land, hopefully getting land back here. But as a call to arms at the end of most of my talks on this subject, what I typically say is, people say, well, what can I do? Well, understand the land where you're at. Understand the history of it, much as my brother Tracy did in the forward to this. It is possible to understand who was there and why the land is important. And if we're respectful to that past, I think we move much more towards reconciliation with the land and with Indigenous peoples.
I'll add to that. It is fascinating, and plants do adapt to their environment. Here, we're in a desert. I'm in New Mexico, and I work a lot with the tribes in Arizona and New Mexico. And so the corn actually has elongated roots, and the roots go down 18 inches to 24 inches. When we look at East Coast, or we look at areas that have water, the corn has very shallow roots because it doesn't need to go down as far. And so if you look at how the people plant, in the East or in the Great Lakes area, you mound, right? Because you want the water to roll off. Here, we waffle. And we waffle because we want concave. We want the water to go in and that to go down so that the roots can grow. So the same way that people adapt to their environment, if you live in a very warm climate, 110 is not that hot in Arizona, especially this year. 110 in some other areas is brutally hot. So again, plants will adapt to their environment the same way people will. Over time, it takes generations. They say about 7 generations.
Okay, thank you for your responses. So it's not going to happen from taking some seeds or plants from one place and moving it over and just transplanting it. So I can't bring Diné corn to Pennsylvania and plant it and say it's Diné corn, because it's really a part of that entire system that it comes from. Okay, thank you. Next question. How have you managed to value and promote traditional ways of knowing while working within institutional settings where traditional ways of knowing are usually not considered as a valid science or as valid as science? Either person can address that. Guess all of us could who work in such institutions.
Yeah, that's that's a laden question. So I feel fortunate that I try to be as true to the plants as I can, and I've been very fortunate that my educational institution has acknowledged that and even tentatively has sort of celebrated it. So I feel lucky that I don't have to argue over the merits of oral-based knowledge, or that I'm at a business college and I don't monetize my sacred seeds. Everyone seems to be very respectful around the work that we've been doing. So I can't say that I've encountered a whole bunch of problems with respect to this type of work. Dr. Frank?
The same thing. I teach at IAIA, Institute of American Indian Arts. It is a tribal college, and you know, we dig pits and we cook outside, and we have bread ovens, and we use clay that we've dug from the earth, and so we use TEK, and I completely validate oral tradition as a native science, and that is a huge part of my curriculum, my syllabus. And an important part of what I teach. I think Indigenous science is as valid as Western science. And the more people that jump on this in other institutions, I think the more validity we give to this.
Okay, thank you for those responses. Yeah, those of us who work in institutions do the work of helping to make that knowledge valid, right? So my dissertation is about Diné knowledge as well. And it takes those committee members and other allies to support and work through that process. It's hard work. It's hard work. Let's see, the next question. Where can non-natives go to get some seeds to plant and help spread awareness of traditional foods? Mr. Keene, seed guy.
Well, I can speak to what's working here in the Heartland. I think Dr. Frank was saying, or as you were saying as well, you can't just take seeds and take them somewhere else and hope it's gonna grow. It has to be a very careful selection process. Having said that, I do use a couple of seed banks locally. One is Baker Creek out of Missouri, and they're probably my favorite ones. And then Seed Savers out of Iowa. And I know that at least with Seed Savers for sure, they have a process about if there's any seeds that are considered sacred to a certain tribe, and they would like them to have them back for their own ritual purposes, then there is a process of rematriating those seeds back to those tribes. And I believe that the majority of the major seed companies have come to embrace this type of reconciliation work with the rematriation of seeds. But I endorse both of those, Seed Savers out of Iowa and Baker Creek out of Missouri.
Okay. The next question, thank you. What steps can non-Indigenous people do to help support, promote these practices and initiatives? Good question.
I'll go first, and then Taylor, maybe you'll go after. There are lots of ways. Getting involved, volunteering your time in a garden, getting to know the native land, or if there's any organizations in your area, buying native food. So you can now go online. We have the internet. There are little grandmas selling culinary ash that can be used. They are being totally supported by their internet economic little companies. I buy from Mom and Pop. You can support hand harvested wild rice in the Great Lakes region. So don't buy the patty rice, buy the hand harvested wild rice, buy native grown corn, cornmeal, native beans. Ramona Farms in the Tohono O'odham, they grow and sell their own beans. And so when you buy native from native, you support those native enterprises, you support everything associated with that, the TEK, so the song, the prayer, the planting, how to grow, when to grow, how long to grow, all of that indigenous knowledge is supported when you buy that bag of beans, or the bag of corn, or the ash from the grandma that's selling it, 2 tablespoons or a cup. You're supporting these entire initiatives and all of the TEK surrounding that.
The only thing that I would add to that is just you as an individual, do what you're doing now. Educate yourself, teach others, spread the word. Yes, you can eat Indian corn. All corn is Indian corn. In the words of Dr. Jane Mount Pleasant Tuscarora, she refers to the indigenous environmentalism of the last 15,000 years. And I can't think of one statement that is more powerful, that indigenous peoples were not stewards. She doesn't like that word, but we were active participants in harmony with the land and the plants.
Okay, thank you for those responses. Building relationships with Indigenous communities is very important. So if you are looking to support those kind of initiatives, find people, and it's going to take work to build relationships and to maintain them, because that's how we share our knowledges and how we share our trust and our honesty, is by building those relationships, humbling ourselves, because we're asking people to share their intellectual property, like Mr. Keene referred to earlier. So don't expect them just to hand you their notebook. Be ready to do some work. They'll probably start with you digging up the weeds and stuff. So good question though, thank you for asking that. One question says, thank you for the amazing talks. I'm wondering if the presenters have any suggestions for what the student farm at Penn State, which is a predominantly white institution, can do to support seed sovereignty and the native food movement.
Contact those local tribes that were acknowledged in the land acknowledgement and ask them. That's where the journey starts. Typical Indigenous answers.
Oh, that's a good answer. That's the whole point. That's why Mr. Peterson read gave the land acknowledgement. We always start there. Okay, next question. I'm just checking time. So we have some time. Mr. Keene, when you are working on preserving traditional seeds and sharing them, how have you founded these efforts? I would also like to do similar work, but I am aware of the cost of time and money to find them and grow them.
Well, to be perfectly honest, money has never really entered into this equation for me, not very much. It's more of time and research, for sure, in finding these. And like many other Indigenous answers, there's no one way to do it. What I will tell you, once I've started doing this work, that many seeds have found their way towards me. And I know that's a different type of answer, but that's how we often think about this. If your heart is in the right place and you're trying to do good work, then those plants are going to find you. Matter of fact, a whole nother story was in doing a lot of this work, I have come across an ancient lost corn bundle from my mother's tribe. And in it is a very old ear of white Omaha corn that we refer to as mother corn. And so life can be serendipitous and beautiful and mysterious at the same time. So once you start doing the work, then one door will open and then another door will open. And if your heart is open, then you follow it. You have to be courageous. I found a lot of different seeds from a lot of different ways.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Frick, did you have a response to that?
I think that's a beautiful way to phrase it. The only thing is, sometimes when you pray about something or you put it out into your consciousness or the universe, the right people will come to you for exactly what you need. And there are organizations, we've got lots of nonprofits and organizations here in New Mexico where we have seed exchanges. And it's open to all colors. So, the medicine wheel has 4 colors. I was always told yellow, white, black, red. Those are the 4 colors on the medicine wheel. Those are the 4 colors of corn. Those are the 4 races of man. We're in a circle and we're in this together. And so all of us can participate. And so you could go to some of these, I don't know exactly in the area of Penn State what is there, but I do know that there are lots of ways to get involved. And I think Taylor Keene said it beautifully. When your heart is in the right place, the plants and seeds, they will find you. They will.
I appreciate what Mr. Keene said in that there's always a different answer, right? It's not always a different answer, but it's very specific. That's why we're land-based, and our lands are our teachers. So if we learn something in one space, we can't just go to another place and expect it to be the same thing. It's a whole different body of knowledge when we go there. The next question, can you speak to the relationship tobacco has to Indigenous foodways and plant sovereignty?
That one's very easy to answer. Tobacco comes first. So most of our tribal teachings say something a lot. Of course, I only know what I've been told, but if you want to do anything right, then you ask Creator. And how do you ask Creator? With tobacco first. And so it is one of the plants that I've grown in our gardens. And then we harvest it in a ceremonial fashion and dry and cure it in a ceremonial fashion and then use it in ceremony. So it is something that we grow, that we respect, but we know that it's paving a way for us as Indigenous peoples to do the good work. The tobacco makes a way for us.
Beautiful answer. I concur. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. We have about 4 minutes. Another question. What are some Indigenous legumes we often consume but don't think of? I just learned about wild rice, long black brown grains, and how it's not at all Afro-Asian rice. What are some Indigenous legumes we don't know but should?
That's all Dr. Frank right there.
Okay, so legume is an interesting word. So beans are legumes, but chickpeas, which are called a garbanzo bean, are technically not a bean, they're a pea. So legumes cover the lentils and the peas and their garbanzos, even those are not Indigenous, but all beans. So black bean, kidney bean, the beautiful Trail of Tear beans, Anasazi beans, all beans, which are a legume, are Indigenous to the Americas and were given to the world by Native people. So you have to sort of understand, ethnobotanically speaking, that legumes is the mother category. Beans are a legume, but not all legumes are beans. I don't know how else to try and simplify that. So the lentil, the chickpeas, all of the English peas, those are all legumes, but they are not indigenous to the Americas. But the true bean is started here and spread all over the world.
Okay, thank you. The next question. Can you speak about any health results you have seen when getting back to a more native diet over the introduced processed diets?
I'll start with that one. So I work with the New Mexico Department of Health. We work with cooks in senior centers. We have a farm to table initiative. We're working with lots of communities and organizations. And we've seen a drop in type 2 diabetes and obesity dramatically when we return to an ancestral diet. So we have people off their entire meds. We have people that couldn't walk that were in wheelchairs due to obesity, that as they started to drop the weight, as they started to get their blood sugar under control, just have completely revolutionized, completely changed their need to go to a pharmacy. And we use the word farm, F-A-R-M, a C, farm, a C, as opposed to P-H-A-R-M, a C. So the idea of food as the pharmacy as opposed to medication.
Mr. Keene, did you have?
The only thing I would add to that, just on a personal basis, I know that once I began to grow my own food, you begin to respect it so much more. And I think any of us who have had gardens and tried to feed ourselves, there's such a joy in knowing that you helped create that food. It makes you respect it more, makes you want to learn as much as possible. I remember one of the teachings from the tribe was that when it came to any of these seeds, every kernel is sacred. And that's something that I've kept with me since the beginning of this project. Helped me keep my blood pressure down, keep my weight down. I feel better, I sleep better. And it's all because I decided to grow food in my backyard rather than grass.
Okay, thank you. So we'll take a couple more questions. I mean, we'll read a couple more questions. I know it's 8:30 now, but if you want to hang with us just for a little bit longer, we'd appreciate that. So one of the questions up is, how can non-native people cook indigenous foods without being appropriating and paying the proper respects?
Great question. Understanding a little bit about it, understanding where it comes from, teaching others about what you know about that, learning and sharing with others. And I think there can be a respectful way to do that. Do your own research, study. I know Dr. Frank and myself, and I only speak in my little bit of time here, but she's dedicated her life's work to this. It's never ending, this journey of learning about plants.
Yeah, so, I did a cookbook. So if you use any recipe that's in my cookbook, I don't consider you appropriating. I want you to learn. I want you to cook. I would encourage you to buy those ingredients from native vendors if and when possible. But it really is about health and wellness and sharing and using the food as the medicine, maybe taking a moment to acknowledge the seed that was planted, that grew, that became a squash, that got harvested, that got cooked, and maybe you cooked it, as we come up to Thanksgiving. I know I'm going to be doing acorn squash with maple syrup and locally harvested pecans, and maybe you just acknowledge, take a moment to thank those ancestors for bringing those foods to us and making them available through the trade routes and through sharing. And be thankful. And I think that appreciation, that feeling of gratitude generates and like a pebble in the pond ripples out, and those ancestors, those spirits, they feel that. And then that's when you're bestowed the goodness and the nourishment and the medicine as food. So you can take any recipe from any cookbook. It's how you prepare it, the intent, the thought, the process. Enjoy it, love it. Don't cook when you're angry. Don't cook when you're mad. Don't put that energy into the food. Put the nourishment, the knowledge of the ancestors, and then feed each other that beauty.
Okay, thank you. Also, when we want to do things that are indigenous or use things without appropriating, both Mr. Keen and Dr. Frank mentioned respect and thanks, giving thanks and honoring. But you also have to, again, build those relationships with indigenous communities and continue to learn from them and stand in solidarity with us when issues come up. You know, there's always reason that we're trying to fight for our sovereignty, our lives, our lands, our knowledges. Stand in solidarity with us, advocate, become allies. This November 19th, one of our allies is going to give a presentation on being a good ally. So look out for that information. So there's ways on the ground, actions that you can take to do things so that you don't feel like you're appropriating, right? So multiple things you can do. Okay, let's do one more question. Let's see. Do you know of any traditional pest fungus control techniques for growing?
Oh, there's so many. More often than not, it's understanding what pests are in your area, understanding the ethnobotany and the ecology of the area. We've learned to live with Japanese beetles, learned to use wood ash and keeping them away. But more importantly than anything else is learning what pests are coming and what attracts them. Even use of night lights attracts a certain type of squash moth. And so we've learned to do that. Learn to identify their larvae and how to combat them. Organic farming is hard. There's books and fields of knowledge on this, but I just learned from master gardeners and other tribes and other seed savers and do the best we can to grow what we can. It's hard. There's many years where you're not going to get anything out of a certain variety until you figure it out. And sometimes the pests just become overwhelming, but we keep trying to live in harmony with everything and create a balance.
We do a lot with companion planting. So marigolds or tomatoes, which emit a smell. Some of the other pests don't like that. So you can plant them in the periphery or near or around some of the other plants. We had terrible squash bugs. You would lift a leaf and you would just see, oh gosh. And so we had to not plant squash in that area for actually 2 seasons until there were no more eggs. We tried the following season and lost it, and that's when we stopped. So again, letting something go fallow or planting another cover crop in that section or area of your garden or your yard. And I agree with Taylor Keen. Nobody should have grass yards. We should all be planting edible landscapes. We should all be able to walk out and eat our front yard. And I have choke cherries, I have yucca, I have pinon, I have fruit trees, I have wild spinach. I have a total edible landscape in a very dry environment. And some I irrigate, others I do not.
Okay, thank you for that good information. I wish I had your phone numbers when my son had bugs all over his butternut squash this past summer. Really great questions, and I'm sorry we can't get to all of them. We have questions about how to learn and support Indigenous people and further TEK. We have questions about how to incorporate into curriculum and build networks. Great questions. That's what I work on. I'm a College of Education. Where can we find places to buy native foods? So many questions. How can universities support Indigenous students in studies about learning about land-grant universities? Just so many good things here. How do we support sovereignty? I think what we can do is, again, continue to build community, continue to support and know the people of the lands, continue to stand in solidarity with us. And that's not just right here, right? That's everywhere. That's every issue from missing and murdered Indigenous women, supporting those causes. That's fighting against mascots. That's just all these not being called something else on CNN. So many different ways to support our efforts. Before I turn it back over to English, just to do a wrap up, I'll let Mr. Peterson share some of the Indigenous things that we have going on. But I want to first of all thank Dr. Frank from myself, I know English will too, and Mr. Keene. I appreciate your knowledge, and I'm humbled by your knowledge, and I look forward to hearing more about the work that you do. So I'm gonna give Mr. Peterson a quick minute to share, and then English will wrap up. So again, thank you everybody for attending tonight.
So as you can see on the screen, students and faculty and staff at Penn State, we have a new student organization known as the Indigenous Peoples Student Association, or IPSA. And they have a number of events coming up in the next couple of weeks here in November. And this is kind of like the inaugural Native American Heritage Month series. And so tomorrow night, we have two individuals who are staff and student from the World Campus who want to share their identity as Indigenous veterans, what it means to be an Indigenous veteran panel. That's tomorrow night. The Zoom link is there. This is going to be sent out in mass emails. If you need to get a hold of this information, it'll be available on the Facebook site. It's a page, ipsa.we.r. The next event is on Thursday night, and that's Dr. Joanne Archibald from the Stolo Nation. It's going to be Indigenous storytelling, the concepts of Indigenous storytelling in education. Next week, there's going to be a panel discussion on what it means to be Indigenous at a PWI. And this will be your peers, Indigenous students here at Penn State, who will share a little bit about themselves and their experience thus far at Penn State. And then that Thursday is one of our student members, a postdoc student, who is developing a allyship presentation that will be shared with the greater Penn State community about how to be a good ally to Indigenous peoples. And so in the last event that will round off the month will be on the 24th. We have a special screening of the N. Scott Momaday Words from a Bear, featuring Jeffrey Palmer, who's Kiowa, currently at Cornell University, will be speaking at 8:30 p.m. And there's the screening link. And once you attend the screening, there'll be a separate link that will be disseminated for Q&A with Jeffrey Palmer. So I just want to say again, thank you. And any information will be found on our Facebook site.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson, for sharing that with the attendees. It's so important for everybody to continue to learn and explore on their own. So I want to take a moment and thank Mr. Keene, Dr. Frank, Mr. Peterson, and Dr. Kulago for sharing some of their cultural knowledge with us today. To the audience, I want to ask, next time you plan out your garden, will you consider planting native foods and how you plant them? And next time you're planning out a meal, will you try to cook a Native American dish? Each day, how will you be mindful of the history of our lands and the interconnectedness with sustainability? And how will you honor and preserve the knowledge that you've been given this evening? I'm going to share my screen now, and we hope that each of you will seek to further your own learning and consider how you celebrate and appreciate Indigenous traditions in your daily lives. And we provided here a list of additional resources for you to explore. So we have seed sources for gardeners. And again, please feel free to take screenshots so that you can use this on your own time. We have other additional resources for everybody. And then for students in the audience, we have classes that you can take. So with that, I will announce that tomorrow everybody will be receiving a link to an online survey, and we greatly appreciate your participation in that. If you are attending for a class, please be sure to select your class in that feedback survey. And thank you again to everybody who joined today. I hope you all have a happy and healthy November week.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to English for organizing this.
Thank you, English.
Thank you, English.